The fog lifting over the North Sea in June 1666 revealed a terrifying sight for the English fleet. Wooden hulls creaked and groaned under the strain of heavy canvas sails as the wind whipped through the rigging. Admiral George Monk stared through his spyglass at the horizon, where a massive wall of Dutch warships emerged from the mist. Cannons roared across the water, sending splinters flying like deadly shrapnel through the crowded decks of the Royal Charles. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the salt spray, creating a choking haze that stung the eyes of terrified sailors. This was the beginning of the 4 days battle, one of the longest and bloodiest naval engagements in human history. The waters of the English Channel and the North Sea were not just shipping lanes, but the jugular veins of European prosperity. Control over these turbulent waves meant control over the spices of the East Indies, the sugar of the Caribbean, and the vast wealth flowing into Amsterdam and London. If the Dutch Republic maintained its dominance, it would strangle the English economy and reduce the island nation to a second-rate power. Conversely, if England could shatter the Dutch navy, it would inherit the mantle of global trade hegemon. Thousands of lives and the future of global empires hung in the balance of every broadside fired in anger. Standing firm against the English ambition was Lieutenant Admiral Michiel de Ruyter, a man whose name struck fear into the hearts of his enemies and hope into his countrymen. Born a humble beer porter's son in Vlissingen, he had risen through the ranks by sheer merit and tactical genius. De Ruyter was not a polished aristocrat like many of his English counterparts, but a seasoned mariner who understood the sea as if it were a living entity. He commanded from the front, earning the fierce loyalty of his sailors, who affectionately called him Besteverer or grandfather. His strategic mind was the greatest weapon the Dutch Republic possessed in this existential struggle for survival. Could a small republic of merchants and traders truly withstand the aggression of a rising monarchical power determined to rule the waves? The English possessed larger ships with heavier guns and a burning desire to reclaim their maritime pride after previous humiliations. The Dutch relied on maneuverability, shallow draft vessels, and the brilliant leadership of men like de Ruyter and Cornelis Tromp. As the fleets closed in for close quarters combat, the world watched with bated breath to see which nation would blink first. Would the sheer firepower of the Royal Navy crush the Dutch spirit, or would tactical brilliance triumph over brute force in the cold waters of the north? The answer came in the thunderous exchange of cannon fire that lasted for 4 grueling days and nights. Despite heavy losses on both sides, the Dutch fleet under de Ruyter managed to inflict a humiliating defeat upon the English Navy. They crippled the English flagship and captured the Prince Royal, burning it to the water line in a display of defiance. The English fleet was forced to retreat to the Thames, leaving the Dutch as the undisputed masters of the sea for the moment. This victory, however, was fleeting as the war dragged on and political tides shifted rapidly across the continent, bringing new challenges to the weary combatants. To understand this violent rivalry, one must look back to the early years of the 17th century, when the Dutch Republic emerged from the shadow of the Spanish Empire. Through innovation in ship design particularly, the flute ship, the Dutch created a merchant fleet that eclipsed all others in Europe. Their ships could be sailed by smaller crews and carry more cargo, allowing them to undercut English freight rates significantly. Amsterdam blossomed into the financial center of the world, where goods from Japan to Brazil were traded in bustling markets. This rapid ascent provoked intense jealousy and anxiety within the merchant classes of London, who felt left behind. English merchants watched with growing frustration as Dutch herring busses fished in British waters and Dutch traders monopolized the Baltic trade. The English economy was stagnating, while their neighbors across the narrow sea grew fat on the profits of global commerce. King Charles I and later the Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell viewed this economic dominance as a direct threat to national security and sovereignty. The belief that the seas should be closed territories controlled by specific nations began to take hold in English political thought. This concept of mare clausum stood in direct opposition to the Dutch principle of mare liberum, or the freedom of the seas. The tension finally snapped with the passing of the Navigation Act of 1651 by the English Parliament. This legislation was a deliberate economic weapon aimed squarely at the Dutch carrying trade. It mandated that all goods imported into England or its colonies must be carried on English ships or ships of the country where the goods originated. This effectively banned Dutch middlemen from English ports and threatened to destroy the foundation of Dutch prosperity. The States General in The Hague saw this as an act of war in all but name and began to expand their naval forces in preparation for the inevitable conflict that loomed ahead. The spark that ignited the First Anglo Dutch War occurred off the coast of Dover in May 1652. A Dutch convoy commanded by Martin Tromp encountered an English squadron led by Robert Blake. Tensions were high regarding the English demand that foreign ships strike their flags in salute to the English Navy. When Tromp hesitated to lower his flag, Blake fired a warning shot that quickly escalated into a full-scale battle. The Battle of Goodwin Sands ended inconclusively, but it signaled the start of open hostilities between the two Protestant nations. It was a war neither side truly wanted, yet neither could afford to avoid. The early engagements of the First Anglo-Dutch War revealed the different philosophies of the two navies. The English ships were generally larger and more heavily built, designed for close-range battering matches. The Dutch ships were lighter and flatter-bottomed to navigate the shallow waters of their home coast. At the Battle of the Kentish Knock in October 1652, the English used their superior firepower to drive the Dutch back. However, the Dutch were resilient, and their ability to repair and refit their ships quickly meant that victories were rarely decisive. The war became a contest of attrition, where the side with the deeper pockets would prevail. By the winter of 1652, the Dutch had gained the upper hand following the Battle of Dungeness. Martin Tromp famously was said to have hoisted a broom to his masthead to signify that he had swept the English from the sea. This humiliation spurred the English to reform their naval tactics. Under the guidance of generals at sea like Robert Blake, the English developed the line of battle tactic. This formation required ships to form a continuous line to maximize their broadside fire and protect their vulnerable sterns. It was a revolutionary development that would dominate naval warfare for the next 2 centuries. The effectiveness of the new English tactics was proven at the Battle of Portland in February 1653. For 3 days, the fleets clashed in a running battle up the English Channel. Although the Dutch managed to save most of their merchant convoy, they lost several warships and suffered heavy casualties. The English blockade of the Dutch coast began to strangle the economy of the Republic. Starvation and poverty spread through the Dutch cities as trade ground to a halt. The pressure on the States General to seek peace mounted daily as the populace rioted in the streets demanding bread and an end to the war. The final blow of the First Anglo-Dutch War came at the Battle of Scheveningen in August 1653. In a desperate attempt to break the English blockade, the Dutch fleet put to sea. The battle was fierce and bloody, resulting in heavy damage to both fleets. Tragically for the Dutch, their beloved Admiral Martin Tromp was killed by a sharpshooter on an English ship. His death was a devastating blow to Dutch morale. Although the English fleet was too damaged to maintain the blockade, the loss of Tromp and the economic ruin forced the Dutch to the negotiating table to accept harsh terms. The Treaty of Westminster, signed in 1654, brought an uneasy peace between the two nations. The Dutch agreed to respect the Navigation Acts and to salute the English flag in the Channel. However, the underlying causes of the conflict remained unresolved. The Dutch economy recovered with astonishing speed, and their global trade network continued to expand. The English felt that they had won the war but lost the peace as they watched Dutch wealth surpass their own yet again. It was clear to observers in both London and Amsterdam that this was merely a truce in a much longer struggle for dominance. Following the restoration of the English monarchy in 1660, King Charles II ascended the throne. While initially friendly towards the Dutch who had hosted him in exile, the commercial rivalry soon drove a wedge between the nations. The English aggressively expanded their colonial presence, seizing Dutch trading posts in West Africa and capturing the colony of New Netherland in North America. The city of New Amsterdam was renamed New York in honor of the king's brother James, the Duke of York. These provocations were intolerable to the Dutch Republic, now led by the astute Grand Pensionary Johan de Witt. As the Second Anglo Dutch War erupted in 1665, the English were confident of a quick victory. However, fate had other plans for the island nation. London was struck by the Great Plague, which killed nearly a quarter of its population, crippling the economy and manpower reserves. While the English Navy won an initial victory at the Battle of Lowestoft, they failed to pursue the fleeing Dutch, allowing them to regroup. The war quickly turned against England as the Dutch forged alliances with France and Denmark, leaving England isolated and facing enemies on multiple fronts. The cost of the war began to spiral out of control. It was during this period of English vulnerability that Michiel de Ruyter truly shone as a naval commander. After the intense 4 days battle in 1666, the Dutch fleet was repaired and back at sea in record time. Although the English scored a victory at the St. James' Day battle later that year, they could not deliver a knockout blow. Then in September 1666, the Great Fire of London reduced the English capital to ashes. The financial heart of the empire was destroyed, making it nearly impossible for Charles II to pay his sailors or fit out his fleet for the next season. By 1667, the English crown was effectively bankrupt. King Charles decided to lay up the heavy warships at Chatham on the Medway River, hoping that peace negotiations at Breda would conclude the war. This decision proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. Johan de Witt and Michiel de Ruyter saw a golden opportunity to strike a decisive blow that would force England to sign a favorable peace. They planned a daring raid deep into English territory, targeting the laid-up fleet in its own anchorage. It was a plan of such audacity that many Dutch captains initially doubted its feasibility. In June 1667, the Dutch fleet appeared in the Thames estuary, causing panic in London. English officials frantically tried to organize defenses, but it was too little too late. The Dutch ships sailed up the Medway River, breaking through the defensive chain that had been stretched across the water to block their path. Dutch Marines stormed the riverbanks, silencing the shore batteries, while fire ships were sent drifting toward the helpless English giants. The Royal Oak, the Loyal London, and the Royal James were all consumed by flames as English sailors fled in terror from the inferno. The humiliation was completed when the Dutch captured the English flagship, the Royal Charles. They towed the massive vessel back to the Netherlands as a war trophy, leaving the English Navy in ruins. The raid on the Medway was the worst defeat in the history of the Royal Navy. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, wrote of the despair in London, noting that everyone feared a Dutch invasion. The psychological impact was immense, forcing Charles II to sign the Treaty of Breda on Dutch terms. The navigation acts were relaxed, and the Dutch economy was saved from strangulation. The impact of the Medway raid resonated deeply within the English psyche, creating a lasting scar on the national consciousness. It was not merely a military defeat, but a violation of the island fortress that had felt secure since the days of the Spanish Armada. Pamphleteers and poets lamented the state of the nation, drawing sharp contrasts between the efficiency of the Dutch Republicans and the perceived decadence of the Stuart court. This internal dissatisfaction sowed the seeds for future political upheavals as the English people began to question the competence of their divinely appointed rulers. The demand for a professional navy free from corruption became a rallying cry for reformers in Parliament. The peace following the Second Anglo Dutch War was short-lived. King Charles II, feeling deeply humiliated by the Medway raid, entered into the secret Treaty of Dover with King Louis XIV of France. In exchange for French subsidies, Charles agreed to join France in a war to destroy the Dutch Republic completely. This betrayal set the stage for the Third Anglo-Dutch War, which began in 1672, a year known in Dutch history as the Rampjaar or Disaster Year. The Republic faced a coordinated attack by England, France, and the bishoprics of Munster and Cologne. The survival of the Dutch Republic now rested entirely on the shoulders of Michiel de Ruyter and his fleet. With the French army sweeping through the Dutch provinces on land, the navy was the only shield preventing a naval invasion from England. At the Battle of Solebay in June 1672, de Ruyter launched a surprise attack on the combined Anglo-French fleet. Despite being outnumbered, he used the shallow waters and confused winds to neutralize the Allied advantage. The battle ended the immediate threat of an invasion and bought the Dutch precious time to organize their land defenses. Inside, the Dutch Republic panic led to a political revolution. The people blamed the regents for the disaster and turned to the House of Orange for salvation. Johan de Witt and his brother Cornelis were brutally murdered by a mob in The Hague, ending the era of true freedom. Prince William III of Orange was appointed stadtholder and took command of the defense. He famously stated that he would die in the last ditch rather than see his country conquered. He ordered the dikes to be breached, flooding the land to stop the advancing French army. While William held the French at the water-line, de Ruyter continued his masterclass in naval defense. In 1673, the English and French fleets made several attempts to land an invasion force on the Dutch coast. In the double battle of Schooneveld, de Ruyter chose his ground, carefully fighting in the shoals where the deep-draft Allied ships could not maneuver effectively. He attacked and retreated repeatedly, wearing down the enemy and preventing them from establishing a beachhead. His tactical brilliance preserved the lifeline of the Republic, allowing trade to continue even amidst the war. The culmination of the naval campaign came at the Battle of Texel in August 1673. The massive Allied fleet once again approached the Dutch coast, intent on landing thousands of troops. De Ruyter, despite being significantly outnumbered, engaged them with ferocious determination. The battle raged for hours, with neither side gaining a clear advantage. However, the French squadron failed to support the English effectively, leading to accusations of betrayal. The Allied fleet was eventually forced to withdraw due to damage and approaching storms. The threat of invasion had been thwarted for the final time. The strategic stalemate at sea was mirrored by a complex diplomatic dance on the continent. While de Ruyter held the coast, the young Prince William of Orange proved to be a formidable statesman. He successfully built a coalition against France, drawing in Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor, who feared the growing power of Louis XIV. This grand alliance forced the French king to disperse his armies, relieving the pressure on the Dutch heartland. The war that was meant to annihilate the Dutch Republic instead transformed it into the pivot point of European resistance against French hegemony. The survival of the Netherlands became essential for the balance of power in Europe. The failure to crush the Dutch Republic caused a political crisis in England. Parliament was furious about the cost of the war and the alliance with Catholic France. The English public admired the heroic stand of the Protestant Dutch against the might of Louis XIV. Pressure mounted on Charles II to end the unpopular conflict. In February 1674, the Treaty of Westminster was signed, ending the Third Anglo Dutch War. The Dutch had successfully defended their independence against overwhelming odds, confirming their status as a great power. Although the wars were over for the moment, the geopolitical landscape had changed forever. The Dutch Republic had survived, but the cost had been enormous. The constant warfare had drained the treasury, and the rise of France posed a new and greater threat to the balance of power in Europe. England, meanwhile, had built a formidable navy and established the infrastructure that would eventually allow it to surpass the Dutch. The rivalry between the two nations began to soften as they realized that their true common enemy was the expansionist ambition of France. The final act of this maritime drama occurred not on the sea, but in the halls of power. In 1688, a coalition of English nobles invited William III of Orange to invade England and depose the Catholic King James II. In what became known as the Glorious Revolution, a massive Dutch fleet larger than the Spanish Armada sailed to Torbay. William landed without opposition and marched on London. The Dutch stadtholder became King William III of England, effectively uniting the two maritime powers under a single leader. This personal union marked the end of the Anglo Dutch Wars and the beginning of a new era of cooperation. The financial innovations of Amsterdam, such as the central bank and stock exchange, were adapted by London, fueling the rise of the British Empire. The Dutch Navy gradually declined in relative power as the Republic focused on land defenses against France, while the Royal Navy assumed the role of guardian of the seas. The fierce competition that had set the North Sea ablaze for decades was replaced by an alliance that would shape the modern world. The legacy of the Anglo Dutch Wars is visible today in the maritime traditions of both nations and the global map. New York retains its Dutch heritage in names like Brooklyn and Harlem, remnants of the time it was New Amsterdam. The Royal Marines trace their origins to the regiments formed during these conflicts. The tactical doctrines developed by Blake and de Ruyter laid the foundation for naval warfare in the Age of Sail. The wars proved that sea power was essential for global dominance, a lesson that empires would heed for centuries to come. The innovations in naval warfare during this period extended beyond tactics to the very construction of the ships themselves. The English and Dutch shipwrights engaged in a technological arms race, constantly refining hull shapes and sail plans. The Dutch introduced the use of signal flags to coordinate fleet movements, a practice that allowed admirals to control their ships amidst the chaos of battle. The English improved their heavy ordnance, casting iron guns that could smash through the thickest oak planks. These advancements transformed naval battles from disorganized melees into disciplined chess matches played out on the open ocean with deadly precision. Michiel de Ruyter, the hero of the Dutch Republic, met his end fighting the French in the Mediterranean in 1676. He died as he had lived on the quarterdeck of his ship, surrounded by his men. His body was returned to Amsterdam, where he was given a magnificent state funeral. To this day, he is revered in the Netherlands as their greatest naval hero. His tomb in the Nieuwe Kerk stands as a monument to a time when a small nation of traders defied the mightiest monarchs of Europe and won. The Anglo Dutch Wars were more than just battles for trade routes, they were a clash of ideologies. It was a struggle between a republican oligarchy and a divine right monarchy, between the freedom of the seas and the closed sea. The resilience of the Dutch Republic demonstrated the power of a modern economy and a professional navy. However, the ultimate victory belonged to the synthesis of these two cultures. The England that emerged from these wars combined Dutch finance with English industrial potential, creating a superpower that would rule the waves for 200 years. It is also crucial to recognize the human cost of these conflicts, which is often overshadowed by the grand narratives of empire. The sailors who manned the fleets were often pressed men taken against their will from coastal villages and merchant ships. They lived in cramped, squalid conditions, where disease killed more men than enemy fire. Scurvy, typhus, and dysentery were constant companions on the long blockades. For the common sailor, the Anglo-Dutch Wars were not about geopolitics or trade monopolies, but about survival in a brutal environment where death could come from a cannonball, a splinter, or a microscopic microbe. As we look back on the smoke-filled horizons of the 17th century, we see the birth pangs of the modern global economy. The cannonballs that flew across the Channel shaped the destiny of continents. The spice trade, the slave trade, and the colonization of the Americas were all forged in the crucible of these naval engagements. The sailors who fought and died in the cold, gray waters of the North Sea were the unknowing architects of the world we live in today. Their sacrifice determined who would control the flow of wealth and power around the globe. The wrecks of the great ships like the Royal Charles and the Breda Road still lie beneath the shifting sands of the seabed, silent witnesses to the ferocity of the conflict. Archaeologists continue to uncover artifacts that tell the human stories behind the grand politics. A sailor's pipe, a rusted cannonball, a fragment of a letter home. These objects remind us that history is made by individuals facing extraordinary circumstances. The roar of the cannons has long since faded, but the ripples of the Anglo-Dutch Wars are still felt in the currents of history. The cultural exchange between the two nations continued even amidst the bloodshed. Dutch artists like the Van de Velde's father and son were invited to England to paint the very battles in which their countrymen had fought. Their works established the tradition of British marine painting, immortalizing the ships and the sea in oil on canvas. Similarly, English political philosophers studied the Dutch model of governance, debating the merits of republicanism versus monarchy. This cross-pollination of ideas ensured that even as they fought, the two nations became inextricably linked, sharing a common intellectual and artistic heritage that transcended the violence of war. In the end, the Anglo Dutch Wars serve as a powerful reminder of the transient nature of power. The Dutch Golden Age burned brightly, but briefly fueled by the courage and enterprise of its people. The torch of maritime supremacy passed to England, but the lessons of the Dutch Republic were not lost. The values of free trade, religious tolerance, and innovation that flourished in Amsterdam found a new home in London and eventually across the Atlantic. The whisper of time tells us that empires may rise and fall, but the human spirit of exploration and resilience endures.